At 64 years old, Eleanor Vance stood before a rusted chain-link fence, holding a deed her ex-husband called a final gift. But what Richard didn't know, what his team of corporate lawyers never bothered to investigate, was that the earth he discarded held a secret older than his greed. You are about to witness the moment a woman left with a toxic liability transformed a wasteland into a miracle. If you've ever been treated like a footnote in someone else's success, if you've been handed a burden and told to be grateful, if you've ever felt the world was closing a door you weren't ready to leave, stay with us. Subscribe now, because what Eleanor discovered when she finally looked beneath the surface will make you believe that justice has a very long memory. Eleanor adjusted the collar of her worn canvas jacket against the biting desert wind. The air here tasted of salt and old iron. In her right hand, she clutched the manila envelope containing the title to 12 acres of what the state called an uninsurable industrial site. In her left pocket, her fingers traced the cold, cracked glass of her father's brass surveyor's compass. It was the only thing she had managed to take from the house before the locks were changed. She had been 26 years old when she sold the small cottage she inherited from her grandmother. She did it to pay for Richard's first heavy equipment lease. She spent the next 38 years sitting in the windowless back office of Vance Industrial, while the sun moved across the sky without her. She was the one who balanced the ledgers when the margins were thin. She was the one who personally called the vendors to ask for extensions so the payroll wouldn't bounce. She worked through the pneumonia she caught in '94 because the audit couldn't wait. When the company finally went public and the bank accounts swelled, Richard took the stage at the gala alone. He thanked his mentors and his board of directors. He did not mention the woman in the third row who had hand-sewn the suit he was wearing to save $500. Eleanor looked at the sign hanging crookedly from the fence. It read, "Caution, hazardous materials." The letters were faded to a dull orange. Beyond the wire, the ground was a bruised purple color, scarred by decades of chemical runoff. Richard had called it a sentimental gesture during the mediation. He told the judge that Eleanor loved the history of the region. He said she deserved a place of her own where she could find peace. The lawyers had smiled. They knew the property was a legal nightmare. They knew the cleanup costs would swallow whatever small settlement she had managed to retain. She remembered the way Richard had looked at her across the mahogany conference table. He had checked his watch 3 times while her attorney spoke. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the gold fountain pen in his hand. "We're just being realistic, Eleanor," he had said. His voice was smooth, the tone he used for difficult shareholders. "At your age, a large estate is a burden. This property is a clean break. It's what's best for everyone." He pushed the envelope toward her and stood up before she could respond. He had a lunch meeting with a woman who was 24 years old and spoke in exclamation points. Now, Eleanor stood at the gate. The padlock was thick with rust. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a heavy iron key. It didn't match the modern, sleek keys to the mansion she had lived in for 3 decades. This key was blunt and stained. She slid it into the lock. It didn't turn at first. She leaned her weight into it, her shoulder pressing against the cold metal of the gate. She felt a sharp pop in her lower back. She ignored it. She twisted the key again. The mechanism groaned and gave way. The gate swung open with a high, thin shriek. Eleanor stepped onto the poisoned earth. Her boots made a crunching sound on the industrial slag. To anyone else, this was a graveyard of progress. There were rusted barrels half buried in the silt. There were concrete foundations where buildings had long since been demolished. The soil was oily and smelled of sulfur. She walked toward the center of the lot, where a single, stunted Joshua tree fought for space among the debris. She stopped and pulled the brass compass from her pocket. The glass was webbed with cracks, but the needle still hunted for north. Her father had used this tool to map the very mountains that framed this valley. He had always told her that the surface of the earth is a lie told to hide the truth of what lies beneath. Eleanor knelt in the dirt. The red clay stained the knees of her trousers immediately. She didn't care. She looked at her phone. There were no messages, no missed calls from the children who had suddenly found themselves too busy to visit once the divorce was finalized. The screen was a blank, black mirror. She took a deep breath of the metallic air. $42.18, she whispered to the empty wind. That was the total in her checking account after the motel room was paid for. It wasn't enough for a lawyer. It wasn't enough for a bulldozer. It wasn't even enough for a full tank of gas to get back to the city. She looked at the compass in her palm. The needle settled. It pointed directly toward a jagged outcropping of rock near the back of the property. She didn't look back. Eleanor Vance, 64 years old, walked the perimeter of the chain-link fence, where the shadows of the limestone cliffs grew long and jagged. She pulled her father's brass compass from her pocket for the second time that hour. The needle danced against the cracked glass. It was a nervous, searching movement. She had been 26 years old when she signed the papers to sell her grandmother's cottage. She handed the check to Richard in a diner that smelled of burnt coffee and ambition. He had promised her that they were building a foundation for a life neither of them could yet imagine. She believed him. She spent the next 38 years proving that belief through the quiet labor of her hands. She managed the billing department from a desk made of 2 sawn-off filing cabinets and a door. She didn't draw a salary for the first 15 years of the business. She did the corporate taxes on the kitchen table while the children slept. She raised 3 sons in the narrow gaps between spreadsheets and inventory audits. She remembered the night in 1989 when the main hydraulic pump on their only loader failed. She stayed up until dawn, calling every parts house in 3 states. She found the piece in a salvage yard 4 hours away. She drove the truck herself to pick it up. She was back before the first shift started at 6 in the morning. Richard had kissed her forehead and called her his secret weapon. As the company grew into Vance Industrial, the desk remained the same, but the distance between them expanded. She stopped being the secret weapon and became the clerical necessity. She wore the same navy wool coat for 9 winters. She told herself the money was better spent on the company's R&D department. She sewed the buttons back on her own blouses, while Richard bought custom-tailored suits for board meetings in the city. When the company went public, she sat in the 14th row of the gallery at the stock exchange. She watched him ring the bell. He didn't look back at the crowd. He looked at the cameras. Her children learned the language of their father early. They spoke of growth and scalability and the necessity of shedding underperforming assets. They looked at their mother and saw a woman who still used a paper planner and a cracked brass compass. They saw a woman who insisted on knowing the names of the warehouse workers' children. To them, she was a relic of a smaller, less efficient time. When the divorce papers arrived, they didn't ask her how she felt. They asked her if she had seen the latest quarterly earnings report. Eleanor stopped at a pile of discarded industrial tires. A small grey lizard skittered over the rubber and vanished into the oily dirt. She remembered the morning Richard told her he was moving into the city full-time. He had been packing a leather suitcase that cost more than her first car. He told her she was too focused on the past. He said he needed someone who looked toward the future. He didn't say the name of the girl who was already waiting for him in the lobby. He didn't have to. The sun was dropping behind the ridge now. The air turned a sharp, brittle cold. Eleanor thought of her daily routine in the big house that was no longer hers. She would wake at 5. She would make the coffee and check the overnight logistics logs. She would walk the gardens and deadhead the roses she had planted when the boys were toddlers. She would wait for a phone call that usually only came when Richard couldn't find his passport. It was a life defined by the needs of people who no longer needed her. She looked at the compass. The needle was still. It pointed toward the base of a crumbling stone wall near the property line. She felt a familiar weight in her chest. It wasn't the heaviness of grief. It was the physical pressure of a decision being made. She had $42.18. She had a bag of clothes and a box of old photographs. And she had 12 acres of dirt that everyone she loved had called a landfill. She reached down and picked up a handful of the soil. It was heavy. It stained her palm a deep, metallic red. She didn't wipe it off. She rubbed the dirt between her thumb and forefinger. She felt the grit of the earth and something else, a texture she hadn't expected. It was smooth, like polished glass, hiding just beneath the surface of the grime. She stood up and wiped her hand on her trousers. She looked at the horizon. The light was almost gone. The silence of the desert was absolute. She was still here. Richard's office smelled of expensive leather and aggressive air conditioning. He sat behind a desk made of Macassar ebony that was larger than Eleanor's first kitchen table. There were 4 other men in the room. 3 of them wore charcoal suits and held gold fountain pens. Richard wore a smile that did not reach his eyes. He pushed a stack of high-bond paper across the polished wood toward Eleanor. "We're worried about you, Elle," Richard said. He leaned back and adjusted the cuff of his bespoke shirt. "At 64, you shouldn't be burdened with capital gains or depreciation schedules. It's too much for one person to manage alone." He checked a notification on his smartwatch. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the reflection of the city skyline in the glass surface of the desk. "We've structured this to give you total peace of mind," the lead attorney said. His name was Sterling. He tapped a paragraph with a manicured finger. "This clause handles the final divestment of the primary residence and the mountain estate." Eleanor looked at the words on the page. She had picked out the stone for the fireplace at the mountain estate. She had spent 3 weeks in 1996 overseeing the installation of the solar array while Richard was in London. "And the business?" Eleanor asked. Richard laughed softly. He took off his glasses and began polishing them with a silk pocket square. "The business is a machine, Eleanor. It needs a different kind of fuel now. You'll be much more comfortable without the stress of the quarterly filings. We're just being realistic about the future." He leaned forward then. He slid a coaster under his water glass so it would not leave a ring on the ebony. It was a small, precise movement. Eleanor remembered the 30 years she had spent polishing the furniture he treated with such casual disregard. "You should have been more financially responsible, Eleanor," Richard said. He replaced his glasses and finally met her eyes. "This is what happens when you live your whole life without thinking about your own equity. You can't expect the company to carry you forever just because you were there at the start." The lawyers exchanged a brief, professional glance. They had heard this speech before. They were ready for the signature. The mansion to the new family trust, the investment portfolios to the children, the logistics empire to the venture capital group. While they exchanged victorious glances and checked their watches for their next appointments, Eleanor received what they called her legacy gift. The legacy was a rusted iron key and a deed for 12 acres of industrial desert. "It's a clean break," Richard said. He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "The old plating site is yours. It's what you always said you wanted, Eleanor. Peace and quiet. A place where nobody will bother you." He knew the soil was poisoned. He knew the state had issued 3 citations for chemical runoff in the last year alone. He was handing her a legal liability and calling it a gift. He was clearing his balance sheet of a toxic asset and her at the same time. Eleanor picked up the fountain pen. Her hand was steady. She didn't look at the lawyers. She looked at Richard. She thought of the 38 years of spreadsheets. She thought of the nights she had slept on a cot in the warehouse to make sure the morning shipments went out on time. She signed the papers. "You gave me this site because you think it's worthless," Eleanor said. Her voice was a whisper, but the room went completely silent. Richard paused with his hand on the door handle. He looked back at her with a mix of pity and impatience. "I gave it to you because it's all that was left," he said. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." He turned and walked out of the room. The lawyers followed him. They moved like a school of fish, synchronized and cold. None of them looked back at the woman sitting at the table. Eleanor picked up the deed and the heavy iron key. She felt the weight of the metal in her palm. It was cold. It was real. She folded the deed and tucked it into the pocket of her canvas jacket. She walked out of the glass office. She walked past the receptionist who had already been told to stop taking her calls. She walked into the elevator and watched the numbers count down to the street level. The door clicked shut behind her. Eleanor Vance sat on the edge of the thin polyester bedspread in a room that smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial cleaner. The walls were a faded shade of yellow that seemed to absorb the dim light from the single bulb overhead. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her wallet. She emptied the contents onto the scarred wood of the nightstand. There were 2 $20 bills, 2 single-dollar bills, a dime, a nickel, and 3 pennies. $42.18. That was the exact sum of 38 years of marriage and 40 years of labor. It was not enough for a deposit on an apartment in the city. It was not enough to hire a car to take her back to the mountain estate she had helped design. It was barely enough to keep her in this motel for another 2 nights. She stared at the coins until they blurred into shiny gray circles. She picked up her phone from the nightstand. The screen was a black, polished mirror, reflecting her own tired face. She pressed the home button. The lock screen showed the date and the time. There were no missed calls. There were no text messages from Michael, her eldest son, who had promised to check on her after the mediation. There was nothing from Stephen, her youngest, who had recently accepted a vice presidency at Richard's new firm. The silence of the device felt heavier than any noise. She opened her call logs. The last outgoing call was to her attorney, who had stopped answering her 3 days ago. The last incoming call was a recorded message from a pharmacy, reminding her to pick up a prescription she no longer had the insurance to cover. She put the phone face down on the table. The silence of the room was absolute. She opened the small canvas bag she had packed in the 20 minutes Richard had given her to leave the house. Inside were 3 shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, and a framed photograph of her grandmother standing in front of a stone cottage. She reached the bottom of the bag and pulled out the brass surveyor's compass. She held it in both hands. The metal was cold against her palms. The crack in the glass face ran from the center to the edge, like a jagged lightning bolt. She remembered her father holding this same instrument while they stood on the ridge above the valley. He had told her that a map only tells you where you are, but a compass tells you where you are meant to go. She looked at the needle now. It swung lazily, searching for its magnetic anchor in the dark. She had nowhere to go but the desert. Richard had given her the industrial site because he believed it was a graveyard. He believed the soil was so poisoned that she would eventually beg him for a place in a managed care facility just to escape the liability. He expected her to fail. He had bet his legal strategy on her helplessness. Eleanor stood up and walked to the window. She pulled back the heavy, dusty curtain. The neon sign of the motel flickered, casting a rhythmic red glow across the parking lot. Her old station wagon was parked under a streetlight. It was the only car she had been allowed to keep because the transmission slipped and the Blue Book value was negligible. She thought about calling her sister in Ohio. She thought about asking for a couch and a quiet corner. Then she remembered the way Richard had laughed when he told her the property was sentimental. He had counted on her being too afraid to actually look at what he had given her. He counted on her shame. Eleanor let the curtain fall shut. She didn't feel shame. She felt a cold, sharp clarity that she hadn't known in decades. The weight of the house and the company and the expectations of her sons had been lifted, leaving only the raw, hard facts of her survival. She put the compass back into her jacket pocket. She packed the $42.18 into her wallet. She picked up her bag and walked toward the door. She didn't check the mirror. She didn't look back at the room. Max, her elderly black Labrador, stood up from the corner and shook himself. His tail hit the wall with a hollow thud. He looked at her with eyes clouded by cataracts, but he didn't hesitate. He followed her out into the cold night air. The engine started on the 3rd try. The radiator of the station wagon groaned and sent a plume of white steam into the dry morning air. Eleanor pulled into a gas station with 2 rusted pumps and a faded red awning. A man in grease-stained coveralls sat on a wooden bench by the door. He looked up and squinted at her through thick glasses. "Radiators blown," Eleanor said. She stepped out of the car. The man stood up slowly. He didn't look at the car. He looked at the brass compass Eleanor held in her hand. "Arthur Vance's daughter," the man said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor froze. "How did you know?" "I'm Silas," he said. He wiped his hands on a rag. "Your father used to come through here every summer. He told me to watch for a woman with a cracked compass. Said you'd come eventually after he passed." He pointed down a narrow dirt track that disappeared behind a jagged ridge. "The plating site is 3 miles that way," Silas said. "We've been waiting for you to see it for yourself." Eleanor drove the last 3 miles with the heat gauge needle buried in the red. She reached the chain-link fence. The property was a scar on the earth. Piles of industrial slag were heaped like black teeth against the limestone. Oily puddles reflected a sky that looked like bruised fruit. It was worse than the photos Richard had shown. It looked like a place where nothing could ever live again. Max hopped out of the car and ran toward the back of the lot. He stopped at a small stone building nestled against the cliffside. It was a one-room structure with a sagging roof and a heavy oak door. Eleanor followed him. She saw a patch of brilliant white stone at the base of the building. It was a vein of pure quartz, untouched by the chemical runoff. It glowed in the harsh desert light. She reached for the iron handle. The wood was dry and splintered. She turned the key. The door opened. At 64 years old, Eleanor Vance learned the true weight of silence and the physical cost of a second chance. The stone building she had found at the edge of the property was little more than a shell. The roof was missing half its shingles, and the interior smelled of damp earth and neglected years. She spent her first morning scrubbing the flagstone floor with a bucket of well water and a handful of stiff desert grass. Her knees clicked like dry twigs every time she knelt. Her lower back felt like a piece of rusted machinery that had been forced to turn after decades of sitting still. She did not allow herself to stop. She used a discarded piece of heavy blue tarp to cover the holes in the roof, securing the edges with stones she hauled from the slag piles. By noon, her hands were swollen, and the skin across her knuckles had begun to crack. She looked at her palms and saw the deep, metallic red of the local clay etched into the lifelines of her skin. It was a different kind of dirt than the carbon paper smudge of the billing office. This dirt felt like a commitment. Her daily routine became a series of small, grinding victories. She woke when the first light hit the limestone cliffs. She boiled water on a single-burner camping stove she had found in the back of the station wagon. She spent the morning clearing the industrial debris away from the stone building, piece by heavy piece. She dragged rusted pipes and shards of corrugated metal to a pile near the gate. She moved slowly, breathing through the sharp stabs of pain in her shoulders. She learned to calculate her movements to save the strength she had left. On the third afternoon, a battered white pickup truck pulled through the open gate. A man climbed out and leaned against the door. He was tall and thin, with a pronounced limp and a face that looked like it had been carved out of the surrounding ridge. He wore a faded denim shirt and a cap with the logo of a university that had likely been closed for years. "You're making a lot of noise for someone who is supposed to be hiding," the man said. Eleanor stopped her work and wiped her forehead with the back of her glove. "I'm not hiding. I'm cleaning. I'm Elias Thorne," he said. He didn't offer a hand. He looked at the stone building and then at the pile of debris. "I taught geology at the college over the hill before they ran out of students. I used to come here 40 years ago. This site has a history that Richard Vance never bothered to read. He told me it was toxic," Eleanor said. Elias walked over to a pile of the purple-tinted slag. He kicked a piece of it with his boot. "The surface is a mess. The plating plant was a crime against the valley. But nature has a way of sealing its best work under the scars." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, magnifying loupe. He handed it to Eleanor. He didn't explain how to use it. He just pointed toward the white quartz vein she had found near the foundation. He stayed for 10 minutes, spoke 3 sentences about the local water table, and drove away without asking for a thing. That night, the desert sky opened. The rain did not fall so much as it collapsed onto the valley. The blue tarp over the roof whipped in the wind like a dying bird. Eleanor lay on her narrow cot, listening to the water find the gaps in her work. The cold seeped through the stone walls and settled into her bones. She pulled her coat over her blankets and felt the sharp edge of her father's compass pressing against her ribs. She reached for her phone on the small wooden crate she used as a table. The battery was at 12%. She checked her messages. The screen showed a 0 next to the notification icon. There were no texts from Michael. There were no voicemails from Stephen. She looked at the last message from Richard's legal team, sent 5 days ago, reminding her that her access to the family health insurance would terminate at the end of the month. She thought, "I cannot fix a leaky roof. I am 64 years old with $38 left, and I cannot fix a leaky roof." The math of the coming winter was a weight she could not lift. She stared at the ceiling, watching a single drop of water form on a beam and fall into the darkness. She felt the silence of the desert pressing against the windows. It felt like an ending. "This is where it ends," she thought. "This is what dying alone looks like." Max moved in the corner. He stood up and walked to the cot, resting his heavy grey muzzle on her hand. He let out a long, shuddering sigh and leaned his weight against her. Eleanor felt the warmth of him through the thin blanket. She felt the steady, slow beat of his heart. She sat up. Her joints screamed at the movement, but she ignored them. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass compass. She didn't look at the needle. She looked at her own reflection in the cracked glass. She saw a woman whose face was smudged with soot and whose hair was a tangled silver mess. But she saw her eyes. They were the same eyes she had used to build a company from a desk made of filing cabinets. She stood up and grabbed a plastic bucket. She climbed onto a chair and jammed the bucket under the main leak in the roof. She went back to the door and looked out at the rain. The water was washing the purple grime off the slag piles, revealing the pale, ancient stone beneath. She didn't look back. The morning after the storm was cold and bright. Eleanor stepped out of the stone building and looked at the ground. The rain had carved deep channels through the purple slag. The oily smell was gone, replaced by the scent of wet earth and ancient dust. She walked toward the center of the lot where Max was already waiting. The dog was sniffing a deep crevice in the mud near the quartz vein she had found. He let out a low whine and looked at her. Eleanor knelt in the wet clay. The dampness soaked through the knees of her trousers instantly. She ignored the sharp ache in her joints. She looked into the channel the water had cut. A sliver of color caught the morning light. It was not the dull purple of the industrial waste. It was a flash of iridescent green and deep fire red. She reached into the mud with her bare hands. She felt something hard and smooth beneath the surface. She pulled at the object, but it was anchored deep in the earth. She used her fingers to scrape away the heavy clay. Her nails were already black with grit. Her hands shook with the effort and the cold. She stopped for a moment to catch her breath. Her chest felt tight. The air was thin and sharp in her lungs. She went back to the work. She cleared more of the mud. The object was a curve of stone, as smooth as glass. She used the hem of her jacket to polish a small section of the surface. The iridescent color flared under her touch. It was a fossil. It was a spiral of shell the size of a dinner plate, embedded in a matrix of pale limestone. The colors shifted as she moved her head. It looked like a piece of the sunset trapped in rock. Eleanor sat back on her heels. She stared at the fossil for a long time. She looked at the channel the rain had cut. There were hundreds of them. The entire shelf of rock beneath the industrial slag was composed of these shimmering spirals. They were stacked one on top of the other, a graveyard of prehistoric life hidden beneath a layer of modern poison. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass surveyor's compass. She held it over the exposed rock. The needle did not point north. It began to vibrate. Then it spun in a slow, frantic circle. She moved the compass closer to the fossilized shelf. The needle snapped toward the stone and stayed there. The metal of the compass felt warm in her hand. She looked at the stone chapel. She looked at the limestone cliffs. She realized the building hadn't been built on the ground. It had been built into a massive geological anomaly. Her father had mapped this valley 50 years ago. He had known what was here. He had left her the compass not to find her way, but to find the truth. "You knew," Eleanor whispered to the empty air. "You knew what they would try to do." She stood up and walked toward the chapel wall. She noticed a small, rectangular stone near the doorframe that looked different from the others. It was set deeper into the mortar. She used a piece of rusted metal to pry at the edges. The stone moved. She pulled it free. Behind it was a hollow space. Inside the wall sat a heavy plastic tube sealed with wax. Eleanor took it to the wooden crate inside the building. Her hands were still trembling. She broke the wax seal with her pocket knife. She pulled out a roll of documents. The paper was thick and smelled of cedar. The first page was an environmental report from 1982. It was signed by a state geologist. She read the first paragraph. Then she read it again. She sat down on the edge of her cot and read the entire document for a third time. The report confirmed that the industrial contamination was superficial. It had never reached the water table, but more importantly, the document identified the property as the most geologically significant site in the western United States. It was a pristine prehistoric seabed containing rare earth minerals and gemstone-quality Ammolite. The value was not in the development of the land. The value was in the ground itself. At the bottom of the report was a handwritten note in her father's precise architectural script. It was dated the month before he died. To Eleanor, "The world will tell you that you are a liability. They will tell you that your time has passed. Do not believe them. The most precious things are always the ones they try to bury. Look deeper." Eleanor looked at the documents. She looked at the compass sitting on the crate. The silence of the desert no longer felt like a weight. It felt like an invitation. She thought of Richard sitting in his glass office. She thought of his lawyers and their polished shoes. They had given her this land because they thought it was a graveyard. She stood up and walked to the door. She looked out at the shimmering field of fossils waiting beneath the mud. She felt a strength in her back that had nothing to do with youth. She knew exactly what she had to do. That was when everything changed. 4 weeks after the storm, Eleanor Vance, 64 years old, stood on a ladder she had fashioned from salvaged 2x4s and rusted baling wire. She was hammering the final edge of a corrugated tin sheet onto the roof of the stone building. She had found the metal sheets buried under a heap of industrial debris near the back fence. They were dented and stained with old oil, but they were solid. Each strike of her hammer rang out across the quiet valley like a bell. The physical labor was no longer a series of painful accidents. It had become a deliberate rhythm. Her hands were no longer swollen or soft. The skin was dark and hard, mapped with new scars that ran alongside the old lines of her life. She moved with a careful economy of motion. She knew exactly how much weight her knees could carry. She knew how to brace her shoulder against a beam to find the center of its strength. She spent her afternoons at the edge of the prehistoric seabed. She used a soft bristled brush and a bucket of filtered water to clear the remaining grime from the Ammolite shelf. It was slow, meticulous work. She sat on a low wooden stool, moving the brush in small, circular motions. As the layer of industrial dust vanished, the stone beneath began to wake up. The iridescent greens and violets flared under her touch. The fossils were not just stones, they were windows into a world that had existed before the concept of money or betrayal. Elias Thorne returned on a warm Tuesday afternoon. He didn't stay in his truck this time. He walked toward the chapel, carrying a heavy canvas bag and a small wooden crate. He stopped 10 feet away from the wall and stood perfectly still. He looked at the iridescent spirals that Eleanor had uncovered. The afternoon sun hit the stone, and the entire base of the building seemed to glow with a deep, internal fire. "You've done more than clean it," Elias said. He knelt and touched the edge of a fossilized shell with the tip of his finger. "This isn't just a deposit, Eleanor. This is a primary outcrop. There hasn't been a find like this in North America in 50 years. He opened his wooden crate and pulled out a series of small, velvet-lined boxes. He showed her how to carefully extract the loose fragments that had been tumbled by the storm. He didn't ask for a percentage. He didn't talk about commissions. He told her about a museum in the city that was looking for a centerpiece. 2 days later, Eleanor drove the station wagon to the city. She didn't go to the glass-walled office building. She went to the university. She met a woman in a lab coat who handled the Ammolite fragments as if they were made of blown glass. The woman didn't look at Eleanor's worn jacket or her stained trousers. She looked at the stone. The check Eleanor received that afternoon was for $4,800. It was for 3 loose fragments. It was more money than Eleanor had seen in her own name in 40 years. She didn't buy a new car. She didn't buy a television. She drove to a local hardware store and bought a pallet of lime mortar and a heavy-duty solar water pump. She bought a set of professional masonry tools and a heavy roll of copper flashing. On her way back, she stopped at a nursery and bought 3 small pomegranate trees and a flat of native sage. By the following month, the property had begun to change its shape. The piles of industrial slag were no longer heaps of trash. Eleanor had organized them into low, stabilizing walls that framed the new paths. She used the solar pump to draw water from the deep well, directing it into a series of shallow stone basins she had carved herself. The water moved through the property in a quiet, cooling circuit. The stone building was no longer a ruin. The new tin roof was capped with copper that gleamed like a new penny in the sun. She had replaced the rotted window frames with cedar she had planed by hand. She used the lime mortar to point the gaps in the stones, sealing the building against the desert wind. The iridescent fossils at the base of the walls acted as a foundation of light. She spent her evenings sitting on the new stone bench she had built near the Joshua tree. She pulled the brass surveyor's compass from her pocket. The needle was steady now. It pointed north, but it felt as if it were anchored. The site no longer looked like a scar on the landscape. It looked like a temple built from the remains of a forgotten sea. The afternoon light came through the gaps in the limestone cliffs in long, golden bands. It hit the surface of the water basins and reflected onto the walls of the chapel. The air smelled of damp stone and the sharp, clean scent of the new sage. For the first time in her life, Eleanor looked at something beautiful and knew that she was the one who had built it. It was enough. 6 months after the morning she first turned the rusty iron key, Eleanor Vance, 64 years old, sat at a table she had built from a salvaged cedar slab and 2 limestone pillars. She was no longer looking at logistics logs or tax depreciation schedules. She was looking at a map of the Western Interior Seaway as it existed 70 million years ago. Her hands, once soft from decades of office work, were now dark and mapped with the permanent history of the desert. The dirt under her fingernails did not come from neglect. It came from the deliberate act of uncovering a legacy. She had spent the last 20 years of her marriage believing she was the scaffolding of Richard's life. She thought her purpose was to hold up the structure until it was strong enough to stand without her. When he tore the scaffolding down, she expected the world to collapse. Instead, she found that the ground beneath her feet was the only thing that had ever been solid. She realized that Richard hadn't taken her life from her. He had simply stopped occupying the space she needed to grow. Eleanor stood and walked to the stone water basin near the Joshua tree. She watched her reflection in the still surface of the water. The silver in her hair caught the afternoon sun, reflecting like the Ammolite in the canyon walls. She did not look like a woman who had been discarded. She looked like the cliffs themselves, weathered, sharp, and enduring. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass surveyor's compass. "I see it now, Dad," Eleanor whispered to the empty valley. "I see why you never sold this place." She wasn't talking to the wind. She was speaking to the man who had taught her that value isn't something you're given, but something you recognize. She realized that her father hadn't left her a toxic asset. He had left her a fortress that required her own strength to unlock. The silence of the desert was no longer a void she had to fill with noise. It was a conversation she was finally learning to join. The community did not arrive with a ribbon-cutting ceremony or a press release. It began with Silas, who brought a crate of fresh peaches and a story about her father's first survey of the ridge. Then came the students from the university, led by Elias Thorne. They didn't come to offer charity. They came with notebooks and brushes, asking for her permission to study the shelf. They treated her not as a widow in a ruin, but as the custodian of a miracle. One afternoon, a woman from the town stopped her car at the gate. She was younger than Eleanor, with tired eyes and a child sleeping in the back seat. She didn't ask about the fossils or the geology. She asked Eleanor how she had managed to fix the roof alone. Eleanor spent 3 hours showing her the way to brace a beam and the recipe for the lime mortar. She didn't give the woman money. She gave her the weight of a hammer and the knowledge of how to use it. By the end of the summer, the hazardous site had become a landmark. People from the valley began to refer to the property as the seabed. They didn't see a wasteland anymore. They saw the iridescent glow of the Ammolite at the base of the chapel walls. They saw the pomegranate trees taking root in the soil Eleanor had spent months amending with compost and sweat. The property had become a place where the history of the earth met the resilience of a single woman. Eleanor sat on her stone bench as the sun dipped below the limestone ridge. Max sat at her feet, his tail making a slow, rhythmic thud against the packed earth. She watched a hawk circle the canyon, riding the thermals of the cooling air. She thought about the mansion with the ebony desk and the glass walls. It felt like a memory of a movie she had seen a long time ago. She no longer defined herself by the man who had left her or the sons who had forgotten her number. She looked at her hands. They were strong. They were hers. She realized that she had spent 40 years building a kingdom for a king who didn't want her. Now, she was standing on a foundation that no one could take away. The transformation of the land was complete, but the transformation of the woman was just beginning. She was no longer afraid of the dark. A black luxury SUV pulled through the gate, its tires crunching on the gravel paths Eleanor had hand-laid over the summer. The engine cut out, leaving a heavy silence that felt intrusive against the sound of the wind. Richard stepped out of the vehicle. He wore a crisp linen suit and Italian leather loafers that were never meant to touch red clay. He stopped and looked at the stone chapel, his eyes narrowing as they caught the iridescent fire of the Ammolite at the base of the walls. "Eleanor," he said, spreading his hands as if to take in the entire horizon. "We've been so worried about you. The boys and I. We've been talking about your health." He walked toward her, but he stopped 3 feet away. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the new solar pump and the copper flashing on the roof. He looked at the pomegranate trees that were already taller than his waist. "The university contact reached out to the company's legal department," Richard said. His voice was smooth, regaining the polished tone of the boardroom. "There are some serious environmental concerns about the way this site is being handled. We're just being realistic, Elle. This is a massive liability for a woman living alone." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a slim leather folder. He didn't offer it to her. He held it like a shield. "I've had the lawyers draw up a rescission of the deed," Richard said. "We'll move you into a beautiful assisted living suite in the city. You'll have 24-hour care. The company will take over the cleanup of the Ammolite shelf. It's what's best for everyone." Eleanor didn't stop her work. She was using a small trowel to pack fresh lime mortar into a gap in the stone. She finished the joint, smoothed it with a steady hand, and set the tool down on the wall. She stood up and finally looked at him. She didn't feel the old familiar flutter of anxiety in her chest. She felt nothing but the warmth of the sun on her shoulders. "You aren't worried about my health, Richard," Eleanor said. Her voice was quiet. It carried across the clearing without effort. Richard paused, his thumb tracing the edge of the leather folder. "You're worried about the mineral rights you accidentally signed over to me," Eleanor continued. "You're worried that the most valuable asset you ever owned is sitting in a desert you called a landfill." "Eleanor," Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Richard said. He took a step closer, his face tightening. You're 64 years old. You can't run a mining operation. You're playing house in a ruin. Eleanor picked up her father's brass compass from the table. She held it in the palm of her hand. The sun hit the cracked glass and sent a sliver of light across Richard's face. He flinched. I'm not running a mining operation, Eleanor said. I'm preserving a history that you were too greedy to see. This land isn't for sale. Not to you. Not to your partners. We can tie this up in court for a decade, Richard snapped. The mask of concern finally slipped, revealing the jagged edge of the man beneath. You don't have the resources to fight me. Eleanor looked past him toward the gate. Silas was pulling his old pickup truck into the lot. Behind him, 2 more cars followed. Students from the university and a neighbor from the valley. They didn't come to protest. They came to work. They parked their cars and began unloading crates and brushes. I'm not alone anymore, Richard, Eleanor said, and I don't need your money to keep this gate locked. She walked toward the chapel door. She didn't wait for him to respond. She didn't look at the leather folder or the luxury SUV. She felt the weight of the iron key in her pocket. It felt like an anchor. You gave me this sight because you thought I was worthless, she said over her shoulder. You were wrong about both. She went inside and closed the door. The lock clicked into place. 1 year after the morning she first turned the rusty iron key, Eleanor Vance stood at the edge of the limestone ridge. The pomegranate trees she had planted in the red clay were heavy with split, ruby-colored fruit. The desert air no longer smelled of sulfur or old iron. It smelled of sage and the cooling dampness of the stone water basins. The stone building was no longer a hidden ruin. A small, hand-carved wooden sign near the gate identified it as the Vance Paleontological Research Station. 2 students from the university sat on the porch, their heads bent over a shared field journal. They didn't look up when Eleanor passed. They were arguing quietly about the mineral composition of the latest Ammolite find. Eleanor walked toward the center of the site. She wore a clean flannel shirt and the same leather boots, now dark with oil and earth. She sat on the stone bench and felt the warmth of the sun on her back. Max lay at her feet, his tail making a slow, content rhythm against the packed dirt. He was older now, but his coat was thick and his eyes were clear. She pulled the brass surveyor's compass from her pocket for the final time. The needle settled instantly, pointing true north toward the high peaks of the range. She looked at the crack in the glass. It no longer looked like a flaw. It looked like a map of the canyons she had come to know. She set the compass down on the cedar table. She looked at the shimmering wall of the chapel, where the prehistoric shells caught the light. The colors moved like liquid fire against the pale limestone. She thought of the 38 years she had spent waiting for someone to tell her she was enough. She realized she had been standing on the answer all along. Eleanor looked at the horizon where the sky met the desert. I'm keeping the gate open, Dad, she whispered. She stood up and walked toward the students on the porch. She didn't look back at the compass or the house she had lost. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The valley was silent. Eleanor Vance's journey from a glass office to a stone chapel proves something the modern world often forgets. Value is not a number on a balance sheet. It is not a title on a mahogany desk. Real worth is found in the things that endure after the noise of the world finally stops. It is found in the dirt under your fingernails and the strength of a roof you shingled with your own hands. Eleanor sat on her porch as the first stars began to pierce the desert canopy. She didn't need the city lights to feel seen. She didn't need a signature on a corporate memo to feel valid. She had built a life out of the rubble of a betrayal. She had turned a toxic legacy into a sanctuary of light. She picked up the brass compass and turned it over in her hands. The metal was warm from the day's sun. The needle didn't hunt anymore. It stayed steady. It was exactly where it belonged. She looked at the moon rising over the limestone ridge. I'm not the scaffolding anymore, Richard, she said softly to the empty valley. I'm the stone. She went inside and set the compass on the cedar table. She turned off the lantern. The Ammolite in the walls continued to glow in the dark, fed by the light of the stars. If Eleanor's story moved you, if you've ever felt like a footnote in someone else's success, if you've been handed a burden and told to be grateful, if you've ever felt the world was closing a door you weren't ready to leave, this was for you. Leave one word in the comments describing the moment Eleanor found the first iridescent spiral in the mud, because Eleanor's story proves something that is always true. The things people discard are often the only things worth keeping. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their best chapters are usually the ones they have to write for themselves. Because together, we prove that dreams don't age.